Some horror novels don't just scare you, they crawl under your skin and stay there for years after reading them. Most of those for me have been ones that most people have never heard of. Today, I'm digging up some of the most disturbing, underrated horror novels, but trust me, by the end of this video, your TBR list will be much longer. First one for me was quite a surprise. I found this completely by chance at Bucket of Blood Books in Chicago. I picked it up just for the cover. I thought it sounded stupid, but little did I know I was in for a big surprise. And that is The Heirloom by Thomas Luke, which is a pseudonym for Graham Masterton. Let's take a look at this cover. This is my very worn copy, but again, I had never heard of it. The cover is just mysterious enough I had to at least check it out. First published in 1981 in the UK, this came to the United States via publication by Pocket Books in 1982. And this one, as the cover might suggest, is literally about a haunted chair. That is the premise of this novel. If you read the back, it talks about an antique dealer who obtains a haunted chair and leads us to believe it causes this family a lot of trouble. Again, I bought this simply for the cover. I don't know if I really ever had plans to read it, but something got into me a couple weeks ago and prompted me to pick it up, and I was thoroughly impressed. It became one of my favorite reads of the year thus far. The Heirloom is about a family whose patriarch is an antiques dealer, and one normal Sunday afternoon, someone drops off this mysterious antique chair as well as some other items on his lawn and says that he basically has to take it. This mysterious man offers him a deal he can't refuse and ends up leaving him the chair and all the other antique items for free. Upon its arrival, the chair immediately starts to wreak havoc on this family. Most notably, a scene that sticks with me is the death of the family dog by this insectoid creature that burrows into the dog when the dog sits on it for a moment, and then the creature explodes out of the dog. So it's a very violent, horrific death for this dog, but that is just the beginning of what's in store for this family. The family tries to get rid of the chair only for it to keep showing back up again in various rooms of the house. The chair influences the weather conditions of the family's property. It's summertime when this book is taking place, but around the property it looks more like autumn. The chair influences some of the artwork inside the house, making it transform into more dark imagery. And the chair itself even murders a skeptical priest that comes by to assist the family when things are starting to get out of hand. Okay, I know that sounds really stupid. A haunted chair that murders people. Sounds like your typical cheesy 80s horror. And in many ways, this book is that, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, as the book progresses, it elevates into something way beyond cheesy and something that you wouldn't expect, i.e. a thwarted act of terrorism. Yes, a book about a haunted antique chair ends with an imminent mass murder. The Heirloom had a very surprising and pretty action-packed ending that ended up having nothing to do with the chair. That, combined with the various murder scenes, including the murder of the priest, definitely made this one of my top horror reads for sure. Next up, published in 1983 by Bantam Books, is Black Christmas by Thomas Altman, which is a pseudonym for Campbell Armstrong. We have this cover here. And you may have heard mentioned before, despite the fact that it shares a title with the famous slasher film from the 80s, this has nothing to do with that movie. When I first picked this up, I believe this was at another used bookstore in Chicago. When I first picked this up, I thought at first glance that it was a novelization of that movie, but after reading the back, I quickly found out that was not the case. This novel does take place during Christmas time, as the title would lead you to believe, and it does involve a serial killer murdering young women, but that's where its similarities with the movie stop. This novel follows the town sheriff in the town of Murdoch as he investigates a serial killer, as I said, murdering young women, but the book also focuses on potential suspects as well as potential victims. I don't usually like police procedural detective type stories. I think they're pretty cookie cutter and follow the same format. However, Black Christmas deviates from this with its bleak, dark voice, as well as its slasher movie-esque murder scenes. Black Christmas is another one I didn't really expect to like. I didn't even think I was going to ever read it. I just bought it for the cover, and in many ways it was just an impulse buy. However, I picked this up around Christmas time. It had been on my shelf for a while, and I was in the mood for a seasonal read. This literally has Christmas in the title, so I said, why not give it a shot? And very quickly, I was fully sucked in, fully immersed in those 80s slasher vibes. Definitely recommend this one. Another favorite of mine is Heirloom by Chet Day, published in 1987 by Pocket Books. I read this one years ago, had to be at least 6 years ago or so, and I remember very shortly before that I had read Full Brutal by Christopher Triano, which is a very popular extreme horror novel about a popular, rich high school girl who has a darker side. And Heirloom by Chet Day is exactly that same premise, except with some nostalgic 80s vibes going along with it. Heirloom is about a high school student named Billy Heirloom, who is the epitome of all-American charm. He's smart, he's rich, popular with the ladies, but he has a psychopathic dark side that he's trying to keep a secret. Chet Day exquisitely brings this psychopathic football player character to life with a more realistic and relatable portrayal. We learn that Billy has gotten the reputation at school of being a little bit of a troublemaker, so his father promises him that if he quits acting up in school, keeps his grades up, etc., that he will buy him a new Porsche. Yes, Billy's family is that rich. I believe, if I remember correctly, his father is a prominent surgeon. On the outside, it seems as if Billy really has gotten his act together. However, in his wake, there always seems to be these mysterious accidents happening. People ending up in the hospital. Some people report receiving obscene phone calls and letters. Someone sets fire to the school, and even some murders occur. We as the reader know that it's Billy committing these acts, but the characters in the novel, in his life, do not know that it's him. So we are kind of inside Billy's head as he not only tries to suppress this, but gets satisfaction for his sick desires, takes pleasure out of them, but then has to keep it all a secret because he has to get that Porsche at the end of the school year. We as the reader get to experience a stark contrast between these outwardly normal high school activities like Billy going to football practice, hanging out with friends, but then alternating to these murderous, violent thoughts that plague him during these normal activities. I personally enjoyed seeing Billy try to hide his true self, yet still dabbling in his psychopathic thoughts, all for the sake of getting this Porsche at the end of the year. I thought that was really realistic. I thought it was a very teenage motivation to get his act together. This book also does contain one of the most brutal beatdown scenes I've ever read. I was lucky enough to find Heirloom in a random used bookstore, but however, thanks to the Paperbacks from Hell resurgence, I believe it's available on Kindle, so it should be easy for any of you to check out. Next up is Home Sweet Home by Ruby Jean Jensen, published in 1985. I know I said at the beginning of this video that I'm going to focus on lesser known titles, and Ruby Jean Jensen is an icon in the vintage horror community, so she's definitely not lesser known. However, when you think about her, you think of creepy dolls, haunted kids, killer kids, things like that. But Home Sweet Home tackles a much darker subject, which made it a must for a video showcasing my favorite titles. In Home Sweet Home, 10-year-old Timmy is sent to stay with a family friend that they call Uncle Dan. Tim is a little apprehensive to go stay with Uncle Dan because they're staying at a cabin in the woods. I believe it's the Ozarks, and he's worried he'll be bored, but he is pleasantly surprised to find other kids already waiting at this cabin. Unfortunately, Uncle Dan and this other character that he references named Little Mother have more sinister intentions with these children. The tension with this one builds throughout the entire novel, starting at the beginning when we as the reader are a little bit creeped out as to why all these children are there at the cabin alone with this adult man and what are his intentions. We later learn that these children at the cabin are orphans, which is another big red flag, and then everything slowly builds from there with Jensen's mastery of atmospheric horror. What makes this such an impactful horror novel for me is how devastating and all too realistic it is once we find out what Dan and Little Mother want to do with these children. Just a warning, this book explores themes of child abuse, which may turn some people off. However, that's what made it so memorable for me because unfortunately it was realistic and just an extremely sad take on a horror novel. Home Sweet Home is a deviation from the supernatural topics that Jensen is more known for. This one deals with real-life horror and a parent's worst nightmare. Last one is Death Obsessed by Robert Essig, and this is not a vintage title. It was actually published in 2018. I'm including this one despite the fact that it's not vintage because I don't see a lot of people talking about this one, and that has to change. This book pays homage to that time period with those VHS classics like Faces of Death, also shock sites like Rotten.com. This book follows our main character Calvin, who as a teenager had a slight obsession with morbid stuff and consumed all of that aforementioned media. He thinks he has outgrown this fascination until a chance meeting with the mysterious Mr. Ghastly character leads him down this rabbit hole towards the promise of one of the most sought-after death scenes. Calvin continues to stumble down this rabbit hole of watching videos, seeing people get decapitated, slaughtered, devastated, to a point that he starts to experience a separation from the reality of his adult life and succumbs further and further to this obsession. This one is a trippy read with some supernatural elements, and Essig's writing really ups the creep factor, and it feels almost like a love letter to those of us who grew up in the early days of the internet and had a secret fascination with these shock sites. That's it for today. Those are my favorite unknown, underrated horror novels that I've read so far. I'm sure there's a lot more out there for me to discover. Leave comments below on what your favorite or creepiest horror novel is, especially if it's something unknown that I need to check out. And until next time, have a good one.